Welcome to The World This Week here on France 24. What a week it's been, and of course it's not yet over. We're going to dissect this week like no other with all the latest on the US election. We'll be asking you, how does America hope to become reunited in the wake of the most bitter election of living memory? Trump's legacy may well be the rise of the far right. His policies, his personal attitudes have emboldened in many ways a branch of politics long thought to have been shamed into silence. Well, silent no more. With Trump's threats of legal action and his inflammatory but it seems baseless claims of election fraud, is he trying to take down the system at the same time as the people vote him out? My guests, both here in Paris and in Washington, to discuss these matters and more. Let's start with in Washington, D.C. François Picard, our very own correspondent there in the U.S. Capitol. He's over there with a guest, Fernando Espuelas, the CEO of the American Latinos United and political journalist on Univision. In Paris, by Skype, we're joined by Gérald Olivier, journalist who is Franco-American and a research associate at the IPSI Institute, author as well of the book Sur la route de la Maison Blanche, un dictionnaire des élections présidentielles américaines. On the road to the White House, a dictionary of the American presidential elections. Great to see you, sir. By Skype, also from Paris, Anne Bagameri, and a regular visitor to this channel, and always welcome, Paris correspondent of law.com. Anne, thanks for being with us. Can I just point out, people joining us by Skype, of course, to fit in with the lockdown here in France and all the restrictions that we have on us because of the coronavirus issue. So our panel here in Paris and in Washington, ready with all the ideas and the analysis. Let's go straight to my friend and colleague, François Picard, who's in Washington with Fernando Espuelas, to get a sense of what the feeling is there as we await the final and confirmed result of this US presidential election. François.
Yeah, election day has turned into election week, and when this Friday began, when the sun rose on the U.S. Capitol, there was the sense that the momentum had shifted, perhaps for good, in favor of Joe Biden. What with Georgia overnight tipping into the Biden camp, they're still counting ballots. They're still counting ballots in Pennsylvania, but mid-morning, same story. The votes there beginning to go in favor of the Democratic Party candidate, and we're waiting on Nevada, we're waiting on Arizona. And yeah, before we talk about litigation and we read the political obituary of Donald Trump, we're still very much right now in vote counting. The vote counting process, Mark, is not over by a long shot. Indeed,
Francois, stay there. We'll be back to you very short. Let's go to Anne Bagameri here in Paris. And good evening to you. Always a pleasure to talk to you. How are you feeling about this whole issue of the vote counting, of the querying of the vote count, the way Donald Trump is behaving?
Well, watching from afar and watching from, surrounded by people from outside the United States, one of the most difficult things to try to explain is how the U.S. system is so, especially the electoral system, is so complicated, so seemingly archaic, and so seemingly subject to litigation. And that's one of the things that's the hardest to explain to your French comrades. From watching from abroad, I am stunned and delighted to see democracy in action. It does appear that this is going about peacefully, which is what you expect in the United States. It's also appearing that Donald Trump is making good on what he started talking about back in April, to question the validity of any vote that isn't for him. So what's happening now in terms of the dust he's kicking up in various courts is not totally surprising. Perhaps the way he's expressing himself is a little bit of a surprise, given that he's claiming victory in an election that hasn't even been decided yet. But lawyers over here, and I'm mainly doing my reporting in the legal community, lawyers over here are pretty stunned at the fact that this election ends up in the courts. It's not something that would happen outside the United States. It's not something that happens in most Western democracies. So that's a little surprising. One thing that it's important to keep in mind, though, is that most of this litigation at this point is at the local level, because American elections, of course, are 50 state elections, not necessarily a national one. So a lot of these actions are at very low-level courts, and a lot of them are getting thrown out. And one of the reasons they're getting thrown out, according to legal observers, is there's simply no evidence that anything that is being claimed in the lawsuits by the campaign is happening. One of the best tweets I saw today was from a law professor at Loyola in Los Angeles, that a lawsuit without provative evidence or evidence that can be proved is really just a tweet with a filing fee. So what I start feeling here is a little bit of impatience to see this process go to its natural end, but also the desire to see it to go to its natural end. And I think I share that with Americans around the world.
Indeed. And tell me that quote again. It's just a tweet with a... Just a tweet
with a filing fee.
A filing fee. Thank you very much indeed. Anne Baggy-Mary, we're back to you very shortly. Fantastic
with a
stuff.
Filing fee.
Nice take on the whole issue. Let's bring in Gérard Olivier, who has put together a really excellent book on the road to the White House, a dictionary of presidential elections. I imagined, Gérard, that there's been nothing quite like this one in your book.
Not recently, because it's like Florida 2000, but 5 times bigger or 7 times bigger, since we have about 7 states that are still not quite decided or still being litigated, because Wisconsin has been given to Biden, but there's a recount going on already in Wisconsin. But you have to go back to, I think, 1876. That was a tough one between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. And Samuel Tilden won the popular vote on that election, eventually losing the White House because of a compromise that was reached within the House of Representatives, I believe. Now, we're not quite there yet. However, what I see in the process, the way we've witnessed it, and I quite agree with Anne regarding the complexity of the U.S. system. And I've been inviting with various French television stations and radio stations to try and tell them what's actually going on there. And it has not been easy having them understand that complexity and the necessity for it being so complex. And I don't know if your viewers followed the press conference from Clark County, Nevada, but that was not an easy one to follow, between the 51,000, the 35,000, the ballots coming in today, the one that were posted on Tuesday that were still accepted, and the fact that they were still going to be counting ballots until November 12th. That's pretty complex. And regarding the fact that the U.S. is still the most powerful and the most advanced country in the world, you wonder why the election system has to be so. Having said that, what I'm worried about is that I feel already, because of what's been going on the past 3-4 days, that who, regardless of who wins this election has the feel, and it will have so especially for the Trump crowd, has the feel that it has been tainted. As you mentioned, the count over the past 3 days is unprecedented in terms of a reversal of fortune. Donald Trump started Tuesday night with 600,000 votes ahead of Biden in Pennsylvania, and right now he's fallen behind. And it appears that now that he's fallen behind, well, the count has been complete. And I can't help remembering what the Pennsylvania Attorney General said or tweeted before the election. He said that in Pennsylvania, all votes would be counted. And when all votes would have been counted, Biden would come out on top. And that was a statement made a couple of days ahead of the vote, and a very strange statement coming from a state attorney general. So I feel like today and tonight in the U.S., there's lots of Americans who are going to feel like something has been going on that was not quite, at least normal. But I have trust in the system. I have trust in the American people. And I'm hopeful that things will remain calm regardless of who ends up winning this election.
Gérard, you said tainted. Then you went on to elaborate on what you meant. And I allowed you to finish to sort of get that full benefit of what you're trying to say. Are you actually sort of saying that Trump has a point? That some electoral fraud may have been taking place?
Absolutely, absolutely.
You,
And
you
I'm not
believe
the
it?
only
You
one
believe that's
using the
happened?
word. Georgia State Representative. Yes, I do believe that's happened. It's happened on both sides, and you can't tell the scale of it. But I think the problem comes from the fact that some states, Pennsylvania, Nevada, for example, keep accepting ballot past the election day. If you look at what's happened in Florida, Florida has provisional ballots. Florida has absentee ballots. They receive them until a certain date, and then they start counting them ahead of the election, so that on election day, they've already accounted for those ballots. And by the end of election day or early the next morning, they have a winner. They have a definite count, which is what happened this year. And the clear winner by a couple of points was Donald Trump. Now, if you take a look at the states where ballots keep coming in after election day, well, somehow, until Trump falls behind, as is the case in Pennsylvania, they keep counting. And somehow they keep finding new ballots. And the bar keeps being pushed back. And this appears very problematic from the point of view of anyone who has voted for Trump and doesn't understand where those ballots come from.
Okay.
Now, there have been instances. There is an institution called Project Veritas, which has had several whistleblower testimonies about ballots being postmarked on the wrong date in order to be accepted to be counted. And so I don't know if those instances have been verified. I don't know if they have any legal value. But if you check Project Veritas, you will find out that they have collected several testimonies regarding voter fraud in Michigan, in Pennsylvania at least.
Okay, Gerald, let me pause you there and let me add, because I need to, in terms of balance for this argument, that nobody agrees with what very few people seem to agree with what Donald Trump is saying. Everyone seems to be saying that basically his claims are baseless. The mayor of Philadelphia is saying that Trump and his team are spewing baseless claims of fraud, and democracy is being done plain and simple. The commissioner, one of the commissioners for the vote in Philadelphia, is saying democracy is one and it's beautiful. So there are different points of view here. Most of them seem to think that Trump is basically trying to, in some way, avoid defeat and trying desperately to sort of keep his presidential grip on the White House. So there we go. Gerald, thank you for your opinion, and thank you for clarifying that you think Trump has a case. Let's go back to François Picard, who's observing matters for us in Washington. The whole atmosphere, Francois, in the light of what has been said by Trump, though, it must mean that the tension, the hostility is mounting.
The hostility is mounting, and I guess this is one I'd love to be able to put to Fernando Espuelas, who's with us, because what you heard Gérald Olivier spell out, the perception of fraud among Trump's supporters, that's true. And whether or not Donald Trump loses, whether or not Donald Trump goes quietly, that perception is going to linger, Fernando.
Undoubtedly, but I'd like to, we can't leave that gentleman's comments out there without correction. There's absolutely no proof of any fraud across this country. If there were, the Republicans would have filed lawsuits, legitimate lawsuits, alleging that fraud with proof. What's happening right now is typical of Donald Trump, who has literally lied over 20,000 times since becoming president, lying once again about an election that he's losing by over 4 million votes right now. Let's remember that in the American system, the Republican Party fielded literally an army of thousands of lawyers all across the country to be able to file in a timely manner any kind of fraud or any allegation of fraud, and they did not do that. Instead, they filed suits that have been dismissed. Every single one of them thus far has been dismissed. In terms of why the ballots are being counted after the election, that's the law. That's the actual law in these states. There's nothing irregular about it. There's nothing abnormal. And lastly, both the legislatures of Pennsylvania and Michigan, Republican-controlled legislatures, refuse to allow the voting authorities to count votes before the election. And when the gentleman referenced why can Florida do it and Michigan not do it, or Pennsylvania not do it, because in Florida, the legislature allowed them to do it, but the Republicans were trying to create this doubt, this very situation, which is that the votes that were sent by mail, which heavily favored Biden, would be counted last. And that is why the vote count is going up as the votes are counted. And that is why Trump, yesterday I think it was, tweeted, "Don't count the votes." Well, of course he doesn't want to count the votes because these are the votes that were mailed in some cases weeks ago, that are only now showing that Biden effectively is winning. And last little point here is Trump is very unlikely to win at this point. He has to reverse the trajectory of the voting in 4 different states, something that no one can see with the outstanding vote how he can do that.
Fernando Esprilla, thank you very much indeed. Francois Picard alongside Fernando in Washington. We've got Gerald Olivier here in Paris and Anne Bagamary too, all dissecting with me, with you, the effect of this US presidential election and looking, of course, at what happens next. We will have more on this in part 2 of The World This Week. Welcome back to The World This Week. We're looking back at a week like no other, at an election like no other in living memory. Donald Trump and Joe Biden currently neck and neck, although the projections and the trajectory is saying that Biden is on course to basically move his team into the White House and take over as the US president. Donald Trump is disputing every step of the way and making allegations of widespread voter fraud. These allegations have been given the lie by almost every local vote count official. And we've heard just a few moments ago from the mayor of Philadelphia, who's talking about the Trump team spewing baseless claims of fraud. He says, Jim Kenney, his name is, that democracy, pure and simple, is being done. Let's introduce you to our guests to discuss the situation and give us some thoughts on where America goes from here. In Washington, D.C., we're joined by Francois Picard, our very own. Francois, good evening to you. And alongside or nearby to Francois, Fernando Esprilla, who is joining us to give us his unique insight. Thank you so very much indeed. Gerald Olivier joins us, author and Franco-American journalist. Gerald, thank you for being with us, sir. And Anne Bagamary, a regular visitor to our studios. Anne, always a pleasure to see you. And can I bring you in to talk about those issues we were just talking about at the end of part 1? This idea that somehow the vote may have been tainted, as some might say, especially from a Donald Trump perspective, but then from the other side of things, the people in charge of the vote saying that the integrity of its safety and democracy has been maintained.
Well, I think a lot of the discussion around this just reflects 2 things. First of all, the incredible complexity of this system. One, of the American voting system, which is basically 50 state systems, and not even Americans really understand, and this has been a big civic lesson for a lot of people. The second is a certain, how can I put this? A misunderstanding of what it means to have a system where you can vote in person and then vote later. All the votes do need to be counted. This idea that Donald Trump had the election in the bag and then people started finding votes to put Joe Biden over the top is simply not the case. It isn't an election. The election isn't over until everything is counted. Donald Trump and the Republican Party encouraged their followers to vote in person, not to vote by mail. He's been attacking the validity and the safety of voting by mail since April, whereas Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party have encouraged Americans to vote by mail as a safety measure, because showing up at the polls in a time of a national pandemic or a global pandemic isn't the safest thing you can possibly do. It's what's called, what Trump is seeing and what we have just all seen is something called the red mirage. It's the fact that Republicans have voted in person and those votes are counted first. Therefore, the early vote counts tend to favor Republicans. And then when you count the votes that have come in later, you start seeing all the Democratic votes. It looks odd. It's not something we've had to deal with in an American election up until now because the volume of mail-in votes is so huge this time. Mail-in and absentee votes in previous elections were a minor factor. Most of the time you could see who was going to be president very soon after the polls closed in most states. This year is very different. And so, a little bit of understanding and a little bit of perspective on what the procedure is and what voting looks like this year gives the lie to pretty much any claim of fraud that you're going to hear from pretty much anybody. I also am not understanding why there have been claims of fraud on both sides. I have yet to hear anybody in the Democratic side assert anything of the sort. Instead, what I've heard from them is to say, let the process run and make every vote count. The claims of fraud are coming entirely from the Republican side, and I think it's important to point that out.
And thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Fernando Espuelas, who's in Washington, D.C. Fernando is, of course, CEO of American Latinos United. Fernando, correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly from our reporting, it turned out that lots of Hispanics, lots of Latinos actually favored Trump.
That's correct. Although we really don't know yet to what extent and where, it's very specific to different states. Absolutely, Trump overperformed with Hispanic voters in Florida. There's some issues perhaps, or there's some evidence perhaps that also in Texas. What we're seeing here is once again the Democratic Party being inept at understanding the largest minority group in the United States, thinking that we're a race, for example, thinking that we're all the same, when in fact there's tremendous amount of diversity within the Hispanic population, and much of to do with a country of origin, length of immigration into the United States, and other factors as well. So clearly, I think the Democrats take the Hispanic vote for granted. Hillary Clinton underperformed Barack Obama, who did not take the Hispanic vote for granted. And unfortunately, it seems like, although, again, we don't have final numbers, so it's hard to say this definitively, it sure seems like Vice President Biden has underperformed with Hispanics. But there are also some anecdotal evidence that in places like North Carolina, Michigan, states that normally do not have a Hispanic campaign, if you will, may have contributed to those victories if they emerge as victories.
It is interesting when you look at the actual breakdown of how these things work out. I wonder whether it is a question of the Democrats maybe looked at it as a single issue, that of immigration, and didn't look at the other things that might interest Latino, Hispanic populations.
Absolutely. Immigration is of concern, but the economy, education, Hispanic Americans are just like other people who are very concerned about their jobs and paying their rent and their mortgages and so forth. I also think that the lack of insight into the tremendous diversity, ideological diversity, for example, when you look at Cuban Americans in South Florida that really went for Trump, not a majority, but an important number of people preferred Trump. Their mindset is very different. Their mindset is ultra conservative, if you will, right-wing, anti-socialist. And the Republicans very smartly messaged to them months and months and months and months and months, trying to convince them that Biden is some sort of radical lefty kind of a guy. And by the time the Democrats picked up on this, which probably was weeks ago, if maybe a couple of months ago, it was really too late because those perceptions were created. And again, this was so predictable if you actually understand the diversity among Hispanic groups in this country. But unfortunately, at the highest level of politics in the Democratic Party, Latinos are completely absent, and therefore we should not be surprised that there's this constant, every 4 years, Democrats wake up to underperforming with Hispanics. This was quite predictable, unfortunately.
A very important ball then has been dropped, and maybe they can make up for it if, obviously, Biden gets into the White House, as it looks like. And as you were pointing out to us, Fernando, the trajectory is definitely in his favour. Let's bring Gerald Olivier back in, who's based here in Paris. His book about the White House, of course, is a wide encyclopedic look at US presidential history. Great to have you with us, Gerald. We're hearing from Fernando there about how the Latino Hispanic interests really have been missed by the Democrats in many ways. Are you, I suppose you obviously see the appeal that Donald Trump had for this part of the voting field. Do you think that really sort of in some way that was why Trump was able to maintain this grip on what was happening, basically this idea of getting back into power when so many pollsters actually had written him off?
Mm-hmm. Yes, actually, there were very many very interesting aspects about this election besides just the fight between Biden and Trump for the White House. But number one, indeed, most pollsters were wrong. And they all erred on the side of Biden. And in the end, we found that it was a neck-and-neck race in very many states. And the first thing that I noticed is for 4 years, we've been told that Donald Trump himself had gotten into the White House because of Russian interference, that he shouldn't really be there, that he doesn't belong to the White House. It is not fit to be president. And we find out that after 4 years, half of America is behind him. And as a Republican, he has made inroads with Latino voters. He has made inroads with black men. Remember, he's supposed to be a racist. He's supposed to be a guy who's allied with white supremacists.
Well, to be fair, Gerald, I mean, he did say things that do have a racist overtone and were outright racist, weren't they?
Yeah, he does.
I mean, it's not a leap to say that he's a white nationalist. It's not a leap to say he has those racial overtones.
Tweeting. No, but what you have to understand if you're talking about Trump is you have to make a distinction between the man Trump and the policy that he's trying to put in place. And I think that a lot of voters were willing to go through the character to have access to those policies. And that explains why we can see that the Republican Party has actually made progress over the past 4 years. I mean, they didn't lose a single seat in the House.
I think that's backed up by the statistics, clearly, isn't it?
By 3, 4 or more. And is what?
It's backed up by the statistics, clearly. I mean, clearly, if you look at how the election has gone in parallel, for instance, in the Senate, it's clearly what you're saying is backed up by those statistics.
But what I mean is that there were 25 Republicans, senators were up for re-election, and Democrats were hoping to flip 5 or 6 of those seats, and they flipped 2, and then they lost 1. So in the end, they only gained 1 seat. And if things stay as they are, the Republicans should maintain their majority within the Senate. Now, this is not in line with saying that the leader of that camp is someone who is not fit to be that leader. And what I see is that there is now a movement that behind Donald Trump that I think will outlast the character of Donald Trump. I don't know what he will do and what he will decide to do if, in fact, he is no longer president starting January 20th of 2021. I don't know if he'll want to come back 4 years from now, but all I know is that he's not an accident of history. He is not some kind of aberration. I think there is a real movement behind him, and that politicians and pollsters and the media should maybe pay a little more attention and grant that those people a little more respect than what they've been getting, because they're not all
Gerald,
white supremacist fanatics.
Let's bring in the other guests to talk a bit more about that, because clearly I think you're making a lot of interesting points, which perhaps Fernando and Anne could pick up on. Fernando, I'll go to you first. I mean, clearly this idea that Trump has created a movement in spite of the reported, how can I put it, seedy things that he's being involved in, which perhaps call his personal integrity into question. Do you think there's something politically there that is going to leave a lasting legacy?
Well, I think, first of all, Gerard seems to continuously ignore the fact that right now Trump is crushing Trump with over 4 million votes, an advantage of 4 million votes. That's double the distance between Hillary Clinton and Trump. And let's remember, Trump lost the popular vote in 2016. He's losing the popular vote even more so. Biden has received so far the historically highest number of voter support in the history of the United States. The second thing I would say is that, in fact, when you look at Congress, what's actually happened is that a lot of the successful Republican congresspeople outperformed Trump in their states. We don't have all the data, but that seems to be the first look at it seems to support that point of view. Said in another way, the American people rejected Donald Trump as president. And with that, they rejected his misogyny, his homophobia, his racism, his corruption, his violation of the Constitution. Let's remember that he was impeached after a very, very long process in which it was found that he basically extorted the president of Ukraine so he could have a fake story to try to beat Biden with. Sure, will people continue to identify with him? I'm sure. Will people think that somehow he has captured some reality? I'm sure. Will everything go back to normal? No, this is the new normal. But at the same time, I do think that with Trump outside of the White House, without the ability to constantly spin reality to his favor and manipulate the United States government to support him in doing it, I think it's going to be a different situation. What does he do from here? Who cares? I don't know. Just as long as he moves out January 20th and we can have normalcy in this country, which is, by the way, Republicans and Democrats throwing tomatoes at each other every single day about policy, not about the truth, not about objective reality, not about the Constitution.
Fernando, thank you. Let's bring in Francois Picard, who's just a very small stone's throw away from where you are, Fernando, in Washington, D.C. Francois, you've been listening to what's being said there. I'm interested in this idea that maybe what Donald Trump has been saying on Twitter or saying in so-called off-the-record or contexts like that is somehow different from what he says as the bona fide president of the United States. For me, there's no difference. What do you think?
It's very different when you're lobbing political hand grenades from Twitter or whether you're lobbing them from the Oval Office. So that point is true. But, you know, here's a prediction for you, Mark. Whatever the outcome, be it in the ballot box or in the courts, it's going to unfold now in this battle royale that we're all witnessing. The prediction is there's going to be an almighty reckoning inside of both political parties. For the Republicans, it's whether or not they continue with that veering towards the hard right, the dog whistle messages to groups that are bluntly racist, or whether it goes back to being the Republican Party of old, you know, fiscal hawks, tough on defense, more conservative when it comes to social values. There's going to be a big fight within the Republican Party, but there's also going to be a big fight within the Democratic Party. They did underperform in this election, and they did misread the polls. Was it the pollsters that got it wrong, or did we read those polls wrong? The number one issue was COVID. Now, we all thought that to mean, oh, Donald Trump is having a poor handling of public health. But actually, a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump, including those minorities, there was a small minority of black people. In fact, in the end, Donald Trump may get a record number of African-American votes, even though Joe Biden can boast, according to some polls, more than 90% of that constituency. Some of them did vote for Donald Trump. Why? Because they're in a country where your health care plan depends on whether or not you have a job. And in this election, it's been painted as Donald Trump is the candidate of keeping the economy open, and Joe Biden is the candidate of shutting it down. Americans are hurting and struggling, and they're afraid.
Francois, thank you. Anne Bagger-Mary, can I bring you in on that one? The complexity of the American electorate never ceases to amaze me. Francois picking up on a number of aspects there, Anne, which show that there are different things that concern different people, and those that you think may fall into a category that may vote Republican or Democrat, you can't really take that for granted.
No, I think that because America is such a big and complex nation, and because the political parties in America, and there really only are two, are so big and complex, I think people look into them and they see what they want to see. And I think one of the ways you can explain, for example, a large contingent of, for example, LGBTQ voters who supported Trump. And there was quite a sizable contingent that did, despite so many of the things he has said and done to abridge their rights, they're looking at something else. They're not looking at what he has done to abridge their rights. They're looking at, for example, the economy. Eduardo mentioned Hispanic voters being not a bloc. There are going to be some who are most concerned about immigration, and there are going to be some that are going to be most concerned about the economy, and there are going to be some who are concerned about social issues like abortion. And I think as the two parties start to look at where they went wrong or what they did right, they're going to be looking, I think, at perhaps not playing so much the politics of identity as they go forward. Oh, he or she is X, therefore he or she will vote Y. They're going to look more in a more granular.
Anne Bagamary stopped in her tracks there by technology.
That
That's the way it goes.
definitely didn't
Anne is
happen.
back. Sorry, Anne, carry on, please. Carry on.
Oh, where did you leave me? Where did I stop?
I'm not quite sure. You were talking about X versus Y, and then they'll necessarily vote Z. It was that kind of issue, I think, where I think you were saying that the parties need to look more closely at who people are and what people's needs are, rather than treating them as a block of people.
Right. I think that this election was special in that sense, too, because it was such a mud fight from the very beginning. And it was done against the backdrop of a pandemic, which is nothing but fear. And people don't make good decisions in a backdrop of fear. And I think that's probably also true for political parties. There will be a reckoning. I completely agree with Francois. I wonder what the Republican Party will make of Donald Trump now that he is no longer president. I wonder if the fear of him will cause a change in the way Republicans approach their roles in governing. I wonder if the record of the Democrats in this election will cause the Democrats to wonder, what do we stand for now? Because we thought we stood for the kind of people who now vote for Donald Trump. What was that all about? It's going to be very, very interesting to see. Very interesting to see.
And thank you very much indeed. We've got 2 minutes left. I'm going to go to Gérald Olivier for a quick final word from him. Gérald, and raising the question about what Donald Trump does next and what the Republicans do next. Can you tell us what you think? Briefly, please.
Well, the Republican Party, if you try to define it today, okay, the Republican Party under Trump, what does it actually stand for? Okay, it stands for national sovereignty. It stands for controlled borders. It stands for legal immigration, not illegal immigration. It stands for protecting American jobs, for bringing American industrial jobs lost to globalization back. It stands for open energy for a country that has the largest energy reserves in the world.
But what will it go on to become?
It stands for deregulations. It stands for lower taxes. It stands for fair international trade as opposed to open free trade. I'm not sure those positions are extreme in any way. To me, they feel closer to what you might call some form of conservative capitalism and national capitalism, whichever word you want to give to him. I think those issues which define Donald Trump's program are going to outlast him and stick within the Republican Party. You can add patriotism, an attachment to the flag. And I don't think it is being an extremist
Olivier,
to actually want to show and pay respect to the flag.
Thank you, Gérald
That's been an
Olivier,
issue
for that
going on
assessment.
in the US for a long time.
I need to stop you, Gérald. Thank you very much indeed. Last word to Fernando Espuelas.
Yes, well, I'll make a very quick prediction, which is that Donald Trump's going to be spending a lot of time with his lawyers. He is under investigation in New York for business corruption, tax issues, bank fraud. He also was named in the settlement of the Michael Cohen indictment as individual number one, the one who set course in this corrupt way to give money to Stormy Daniels. Those things are real. They're working their way through the courts. And once once Trump loses his immunity as president, he will be, just as French presidents have in the past, he will be available to justice, and we'll see what happens there.
Indeed. Trump set to make headlines whatever happens. Thank you to Fernando Espuelas from American Latinos United and Univision. Thank you to Gerald Olivier from here in Paris. Thank you to Anne Bagamary of Law.com. And thanks to our very own Francois Picard, also in Washington, D.C. Most of all, thanks to you for watching. It's been quite a week. This is The World This Week. Stay with us here on France 24.